October 14th, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany. The men of the 8th Air Force called it Black Thursday. The name was earned in the most brutal way possible, paid for in blood at a rate that, if it had continued, would have ended the American strategic bombing campaign before it could achieve anything decisive. 291 B-17 flying fortresses crossed the English Channel that morning, heading for the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. Ball bearings were the kind of target American planners loved. Small, concentrated, critical to everything. Tanks, aircraft engines, submarines, artillery, all of it needed ball bearings. Destroy Schweinfurt, the theory went, and you cripple German war production at a single stroke. The theory was sound. The execution was catastrophic. The problem was simple and had no immediate solution. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings that escorted the bombers could not follow them all the way to Schweinfurt. Their fuel tanks were too small. They could accompany the bombers part way into German territory, far enough to fight off the first waves of German interceptors, and then they had to turn back. For the last 100 miles to the target and the first 100 miles home, the bombers flew alone. The Luftwaffe knew this. They had learned it through experience by tracking the point where the American escorts turned back and timing their own attacks accordingly. German fighter pilots would assemble at lower altitudes, out of range of the American escorts, and wait. When the P-47s reached their fuel limit and turned for England, the Germans rose. On October 14th, they rose in numbers that the bomber crews had never seen. German controllers had positioned over 300 fighters along the route to Schweinfurt. They attacked in coordinated waves, head-on from 12 o'clock, slashing from the sides, pursuit attacks from behind. German pilots flew with a ferocity born of desperation. These were their factories, their cities. Their tactics were perfectly suited to the unescorted bombers they were facing. By the time the surviving B-17 crossed back over the English Channel, 60 of the 291 that had departed that morning were gone. Another 17 were so badly damaged they would never fly again. 594 American airmen were dead, wounded, or missing in a single afternoon. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt were damaged. German production was disrupted for several weeks before repairs were completed and output resumed. It was not nothing, but it was nowhere near the decisive blow the planners had promised. And the cost had been so high that the 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids into Germany immediately after Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe had fought the 8th Air Force to a standstill. In London and Washington, the men responsible for the campaign looked at the numbers. The current approach, send bombers deep into Germany without escort, bomb factories, hope for the best, was failing. Not slowly, catastrophically. One of those men was General Carl Andrew Spaatz. Spaatz was 52 years old, a former test pilot and one of the most experienced airmen in the American military. He read numbers with the cold precision of an accountant rather than the optimism of an advocate. He looked at the Schweinfurt losses, and he looked at the broader picture. The Luftwaffe was not weakening. Despite months of bombing, German fighter production was actually increasing. The factories being targeted were damaged, repaired, and damaged again in a cycle that was costing more American lives than it was costing Germany aircraft. He had a different idea. Not about what to bomb, about what the bombing was supposed to accomplish. That distinction, between the target and the purpose, would eventually end the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. Without the Americans having to shoot down a single German aircraft to do it. Adolf Galland had been fighting the Americans since before most of them knew a war was happening. He was 31 years old in October 1943, with 104 aerial victories to his name and the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds hanging at his throat. Germany's highest military decoration, awarded to fewer than 30 men in the entire war. He had fought in Spain, in France, over Britain, and now over Germany itself, defending the Reich against the bombers that came every day in formations so large they darkened the sky. He was also, by this point, deeply unhappy. Not about the fighting. Galen lived to fly and flew to fight. He was unhappy because he could see, with the clarity of a man who spent more hours in a cockpit than behind a desk, exactly what was happening to the force he commanded. And he could see that the decisions above him were making it worse. After Schweinfurt, Galen wrote a report that infuriated Hermann Göring. The report said the fighter arm was winning individual battles and losing the war. Kill ratios against unescorted bombers were excellent, but the losses fell disproportionately on experienced pilots, men who had flown since the Battle of Britain, who had learned everything hard. These men were dying faster than new pilots could be trained to replace them. Galen argued that Germany needed more fighters, faster fighters, better trained pilots preserved through tactics that didn't require flying head-on into formations of B-17 with 10 machine guns per aircraft. He argued for a coherent defensive strategy rather than the piecemeal response Göring kept demanding. Göring's response was to call Galland a coward. Galland was not a coward. 104 victories proved that. But Göring's frustration came from a real place. German pilots were destroying American bombers in large numbers. The 8th Air Force had suspended deep penetration raids after Schweinfurt. From Göring's perspective, the fighter arm was doing its job. The problem was leadership that refused to see the situation deteriorating. What neither man could see was that the Americans were about to change the equation in a way that would make the dogfight numbers irrelevant. The P-51 Mustang, paired with drop tanks, could escort bombers all the way to any target in Germany and all the way back. Its performance at altitude matched or exceeded anything the Luftwaffe flew. American factories were producing them at a rate German industry could not match. On January 6, 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. His first significant decision redefined the entire mission. American fighters, Doolittle announced, were no longer simply escorts. They were hunters. They were not to remain with the bomber formations when German fighters appeared. They were to pursue and destroy the enemy, in the air, on the ground, wherever they could be found. This was not popular with bomber crews who felt abandoned. It would prove to be correct. Because Doolittle's order, combined with Spatz's emerging theory about the real target, was about to create the conditions for the destruction of the Luftwaffe, without the Americans winning a single decisive air battle. The Germans were about to learn it was possible to lose a war in the air without losing any particular fight in the sky. In refineries, in fuel tanks running empty, in training fields where new pilots sat in aircraft they could not fly because there was nothing to put in the engines. Galland would understand this before it was over. He would watch it happen and be unable to stop it. And the report he would eventually write about it would be even more direct than the one that had enraged Göring. Because by the time he wrote it, there was nothing left to lose by telling the truth. The question Karl Spatz kept returning to was deceptively simple. What does the Luftwaffe actually need to fight? Not aircraft. Germany was producing over 3,000 fighters per month by spring 1944. Record numbers. The bombing campaign had disrupted production, but German industry adapted with remarkable speed, dispersing manufacturing to hundreds of smaller facilities. Every month the 8th Air Force bombed a factory, German engineers rebuilt it faster than before. Not pilots exactly. Germany had pilots. Experienced ones were dying faster than replacements could be trained. But the system was still producing men who could take off. The problem was not their absence, but their inadequacy. 60 hours of training was not enough to survive against P-51 pilots with 500. What the Luftwaffe needed, what it could not function without even for a single day, was fuel. Aviation fuel. the high-octane gasoline that engines required to operate. Without it, the most advanced fighter in the world was stationary metal. Without it, a trained pilot was a man with nowhere to go. Without it, the thousands of aircraft Germany produced every month would sit on airfields and rot. Germany's fuel situation in early 1944 was not yet critical, but it was fragile. The Reich produced aviation fuel from two sources: natural petroleum from Romania's Ploiești refineries, and synthetic fuel produced by converting coal into oil, a chemical process that Germany had mastered out of necessity. There were 14 major synthetic fuel plants. Together, they produced the majority of Germany's aviation gasoline. They could not be dispersed. The equipment was massive and specialized. And unlike aircraft factories, which could be rebuilt within weeks, a badly damaged fuel plant required months before it could resume production. Spaatz understood the arithmetic. Destroy the 14 plants. Destroy the Ploiești refineries in Romania. Destroy the fuel. And then watch what happens to an air force that has aircraft, has pilots, has every intention of fighting, and cannot put a single plane in the air. An air force, in other words, that has already lost, even if it doesn't know it yet. The objections were immediate and came from every direction. Eisenhower's planners wanted the bombers on French railways. Cut the railways, and Germany couldn't move troops to oppose the Normandy invasion. RAF Bomber Command's Arthur Harris wanted to continue area bombing of German cities, which he believed was the most direct route to breaking civilian morale and ending the war. Military economists wanted aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, rubber production. Everyone had a theory. Everyone was certain their target was the decisive one. Spaatz listened. He acknowledged the merits of the railway plan, found common ground with Harris where he could, and kept pushing, quietly, persistently, for permission to test his oil theory against a real target. The permission came, reluctantly, in May 1944. Eisenhower gave Spaatz 2 trial raids against synthetic oil targets. Just 2. If results justified it, they would expand. If not, the oil campaign would be set aside. Spaatz accepted the conditions. He had been making this argument since January. 2 raids were not what he had asked for. They were what he had been given. He scheduled the first for May 12, 1944. 900 bombers. 735 fighters. Targets? The synthetic fuel plants at Merseburg, Lütgendorf, Zeitz, Brooks, and Bohlen. In Berlin, Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, would later say that date was the day the war ended for Germany. Not the day Germany surrendered. Not the day Berlin fell. May 12, 1944. The day the first American bombs hit a synthetic fuel plant. Speer knew what it meant immediately. Hitler refused to believe him. May 12, 1944. 0600 hours. Airfields across England. 900 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators climbed through the English dawn, assembling into the massive formations that had become the signature of American air power. Hundreds of aircraft in precise boxes, contrails stretching across the sky, the roar of thousands of engines audible from the ground miles below. German radar operators tracking the formation saw immediately that this was different. Not the size, large raids had been coming for months. The direction. Deep into central Germany, toward targets German controllers had never seen the Americans attack. They scrambled their fighters. What happened next confirmed everything Spaatz had theorized and revealed something the Germans had not expected. The Luftwaffe rose in the largest single-day fighter deployment of the entire air war. Over 500 aircraft in coordinated waves, the same concentrated effort that had devastated the 8th at Schweinfurt. The battle over central Germany was savage. Bomber crews counted parachutes. German pilots flew with the desperation of men defending something irreplaceable. And the American escorts stayed with them. This was the critical difference from Schweinfurt. The P-51 Mustangs flew all the way to the targets and all the way home. When German fighters attacked the bombers, P-51s intercepted them. When German pilots tried to reassemble for a second pass, P-51s pursued them. When German pilots broke off to land and refuel, P-51s followed them down and strafed them on the airfields. The Germans lost 65 aircraft that day. The Americans lost 46 bombers and 12 fighters. By the mathematics of air combat, this was not a decisive American victory. 46 bombers meant 460 airmen dead or captured. But Spaatz was not looking at the dogfight numbers. He was looking at the reconnaissance photographs taken immediately after the raid. The synthetic fuel plants at Merseburg and the other targets were burning. The damage assessment teams worked through the night. Their report reached Spaatz's headquarters the following morning. German synthetic fuel production had been cut by approximately 50% in a single day. In Berlin, Speer was already on the phone to Hitler's headquarters. He had spent years managing the German war economy, absorbing bombing damage through dispersal and repair. He had watched factories get hit and rebuilt, ball bearing plants take damage and recover. He understood which targets the German economy could survive losing. Fuel was the one it could not survive losing. The Americans had found the weak point. If they continued, Germany would lose aviation gasoline production within months. The Luftwaffe would be grounded. The army would lose armored mobility. The war would be over. Hitler's response was characteristic. German ingenuity would find solutions. Repair teams would restore production. The fighter arm would protect the plants better next time. Speer was being defeatist. Speer wrote in his diary that evening, "The enemy has struck us at one of our weakest points. If they persist at it this time, we will soon no longer have any fuel production worth mentioning." Then he added a sentence that captured the particular horror of watching a disaster unfold in slow motion while the man in charge refused to see it. Our one hope is that the other side has an Air Force general staff as scatterbrained as ours. They did not. Spaatz had already scheduled the second trial raid, and after that one, he would no longer need Eisenhower's permission. The results would make the argument for him. Adolf Galland landed his aircraft and walked into the operations room at his headquarters outside Berlin. The date was May 13th, 1944, the morning after the first American raid on the synthetic fuel plants. The reports on his desk told a story he had been dreading for months. Not the combat losses, those were bad, but the Luftwaffe had absorbed bad days before. What Galland was reading was the preliminary assessment of the previous day's production losses. The fuel plants at Merseburg had been hit with a precision German intelligence had not expected American bombing to achieve. The damage reports used words like catastrophic and irreparable in the near term. Galland understood immediately what it meant. He had spent the previous year arguing with people who outranked him about the trajectory of the air war. He had watched the experienced pilot corps erode month by month, replaced by men technically capable of flying, but not of surviving against P-51s. He had watched fighter production increase while operational readiness declined. You could build aircraft faster than you could build fuel or train the pilots to fly them effectively. And now the fuel itself was under attack. He requested an urgent meeting with Göring's staff. The meeting was not immediately granted. Göring's headquarters did not accommodate urgency easily, particularly when urgency meant delivering bad news to a man who responded to bad news with accusations of cowardice. Galland prepared his assessment anyway. Germany's synthetic plants produced approximately 175,000 tons of aviation gasoline per month before the raid. If the Americans continued at anything approaching May 12th's intensity, production could fall below 50,000 tons within 60 days. The Luftwaffe required a minimum of 160,000 tons for normal operations. Below 50,000? Normal operations impossible. Below 30,000? Even combat would have to be curtailed. But the math was not what troubled Galland most. What troubled him was the implication for the men he commanded. The new pilots already arriving with training that was inadequate to keep them alive. German pilot training had already been cut before the fuel campaign began. Experienced instructors had been sent to the front. The curriculum had been shortened, not once but several times, as urgency of getting pilots to units overtook the question of whether they were ready. A new Luftwaffe pilot in May 1944 arrived at a frontline unit with approximately 60 hours of flying time. His American counterpart had 300 or more. The skill gap was killing new German pilots in their first days of operational service at rates that could only be described as systematic slaughter. And now, the fuel for training was about to get significantly worse. If production fell as projected, training would be cut again, perhaps to 30 hours, perhaps less. Men who might have become capable pilots would be sent against P-51 veterans with less experience than a peacetime commercial license required. They would not come back. Galland looked at the numbers one last time. He had commanded the fighter arm for 3 years, had flown combat himself, had friends buried in every theater Germany had fought. But the numbers describe something beyond military strategy. They describe the systematic destruction of a generation of young German men, sent into the sky without the tools to survive, because an American general had identified the one thing that could not be replaced fast enough to matter. The math pointed only one direction, and Galland had been pointing in that direction for a year, while everyone above him looked somewhere else. Galland signed the assessment and sent it up the chain. Goering would tell him he was being a defeatist. He was being accurate. The second trial raid came on May 28, 1944. Spats sent 888 bombers and 1,282 fighters against oil targets that included the massive synthetic fuel complex at Luna, one of Germany's most critical production facilities. The Luftwaffe again committed everything available. The battle again was savage. And again, the American escorts went all the way. German fuel production fell another 20%. Engineers were fighting to keep multiple facilities running simultaneously, cannibalizing parts from damaged sections to maintain any output at all. Spats had his evidence. He went directly to Eisenhower with the reconnaissance photographs and a straightforward argument. The oil campaign worked, faster than any previous target system. The Luftwaffe was defending the plants with everything available, which meant it was not concentrating over Normandy. Destroy the fuel, and you destroy the air threat to the invasion simultaneously. Eisenhower gave his approval. The oil campaign was no longer an experiment. It was the primary target for American strategic bombing. What followed was methodical and relentless. Between June and September 1944, American bombers struck German fuel facilities 210 times. Production fell from 175,000 tons in April to 107,000 in June, to 52,000 in July, to 10,000 in September. 10,000 tons, 6% of what Germany had produced before the campaign began. The Luftwaffe's response told the story more clearly than any production figure. German pilots were scrambled to defend the fuel plants on every raid, not because it was their primary mission, but because the plants were irreplaceable. Lose 100 fighters defending a factory, and you could build replacements. Lose a fuel plant, and you couldn't fly any of them. German controllers committed their best pilots to facilities the Americans kept finding and kept hitting. The German pilots who survived were extraordinary. Men like Erich Hartmann, who would finish the war with 352 aerial victories, the highest total in military aviation history, continued to fly with a skill no fuel shortage could erase. The core of experienced aces remained deadly despite every disadvantage. But they were a shrinking minority in a force disintegrating around them. For every experienced pilot who survived into autumn 1944, there were a dozen new arrivals who did not. The training pipeline, already compressed, was strangled by the oil campaign. Training fuel was cut 60%. Student pilots who should have had 6 months of instruction were pushed through in weeks and sent to operational units, themselves running short. In October 1944, the Luftwaffe issued an order that captured the situation with painful clarity. Operational flying was to be restricted to combat missions only. No training flights, no administrative flying. Every liter of aviation fuel preserved for the defense of the Reich. It was rational. It was also a death sentence for the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. Every pilot who didn't train was less capable tomorrow, in an environment where capability was already the difference between surviving a mission and not. Galland read the order and understood its meaning precisely. The Americans had not defeated the Luftwaffe in the air. They had not won a decisive dogfight or built an aircraft the Germans couldn't match. They had done something more elegant and more devastating. They had made the Luftwaffe irrelevant on the ground. And the worst of it, the part Galland could not make peace with even years later, was that it had been preventable. If the plants had been better defended from the first raid, if the warnings had been heeded, if anyone had listened. June 6, 1944, D-Day. 14,674 Allied aircraft flew that day over the beaches of Normandy. The Luftwaffe launched 2. Not 2 squadrons, not 2 groups, 2 individual aircraft, a pair of FW-190s who made a single pass over the beaches and then turned for home before the overwhelming number of Allied fighters could destroy them. It was not a tactical decision. It was a mathematical one. There was no fuel to send more. There were no pilots trained to the standard required to survive in the airspace above Normandy. General Eisenhower was standing on the beach at Normandy 3 days after D-Day when his son John, recently graduated from West Point, commented that the military vehicles moving bumper to bumper along the beach roads would be in direct violation of textbook doctrine under fire. Eisenhower replied, "You'd never get away with this if you didn't have air supremacy." He said it as a statement of operational reality. Air supremacy over Normandy was not an advantage. It was a prerequisite. Without it, the logistics he was watching would have been destroyed. Without it, the landing itself might have failed. Spaatz understood this before Normandy happened. It was the central argument he had been making since January. Destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to fight over Normandy was not a separate objective from destroying its fuel. They were the same objective. An air force without fuel cannot defend a beach any more than it can attack a bomber formation. But what happened in the weeks and months after D-Day told a story that went beyond the invasion itself. By September 1944, synthetic fuel output had fallen to 10,000 tons per month, a number so low that the Luftwaffe was forced to make choices that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Which units flew and which stayed grounded? Which missions were worth the fuel? Which pilots received any fuel at all for the training that might keep them alive? Elite units received priority. The remnants of Germany's experienced pilot corps were allocated what fuel remained for the missions that mattered most. Defense of the fuel plants themselves, the brutal irony that Galland noted in his post-war memoirs. Defense of Berlin. New pilots sat in aircraft they couldn't fly, on airfields they couldn't leave. Of 57 Luftwaffe fighters dispatched from Wiesbaden to Normandy in the weeks after D-Day, only 3 arrived. The rest destroyed en route, turned back by fuel shortages, or lost to mechanical failure. Of 22 FW-190s sent from Cologne, only 2 reached Normandy. Galland wrote of this period in his post-war memoir with a precision more devastating than any emotional language. The Luftwaffe that had fought the 8th Air Force to a standstill over Schweinfurt in October 1943 was, by the summer of 1944, a force that could not reliably get its aircraft from one German city to another. Spaatz read the intelligence reports and understood what they confirmed. The oil campaign had not just restricted the Luftwaffe's ability to fight, it had restricted its ability to exist as an operational military force. The difference between those two things was the difference between an enemy that was dangerous and an enemy that was defeated. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous. Its best pilots were still extraordinary. The aircraft it produced, when it could fuel them, were competitive with anything the Allies had. But an air force that cannot move is not an air force. It is inventory. In December 1944, Adolf Hitler launched the last great German offensive of the Second World War. The Battle of the Bulge sent 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks through the Ardennes, striking the thinly held American lines in what Hitler believed would split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Soviet army reached Germany from the east. To support the offensive, the Luftwaffe assembled 2,460 aircraft. On paper, a force capable of challenging American air superiority. In practice, nearly irrelevant. The problem was not aircraft, it was fuel. The Ardennes offensive had been planned around the expectation that German forces would capture American fuel depots as they advanced. When American troops held the depots, the armored columns ran out of fuel in the Belgian countryside. Tanks sat on roads. Trucks stopped. The momentum ended. Not because of American tactical ingenuity, but because the fuel to sustain it was gone. The Luftwaffe's 2,460 aircraft managed one limited offensive, Operation Bodenplatte, January 1, 1945. A low-level strike on Allied airfields that destroyed nearly 300 aircraft on the ground. It was the Luftwaffe's last significant offensive operation of the war. It also cost Germany nearly 300 of its own aircraft and 214 pilots, many of them experienced men who could not be replaced. New pilots arriving at frontline units had sometimes never fired their guns in practice. Galland watched Bodenplatte with the anguish of a man who had argued for a different strategy for 2 years. The Allied aircraft destroyed were replaced within weeks. The German pilots killed could not be replaced at all. He was relieved of command shortly afterward, a combination of political pressure and Goering's frustration with his persistent criticism. Placed under arrest, then quietly reassigned to a small unit of Me-262 jets, the aircraft he had been arguing for all along. He spent the final months of the war flying combat missions in the aircraft that might, deployed properly and in time, have changed everything. He shot down 7 Allied aircraft in those months. His final total? 104. The same number he had carried since October 1943, when there was still fuel in the tanks. In London, Spaatz was reading the final intelligence assessments. German fuel production had not recovered. The brief periods when repair crews restored some output were consistently ended by return raids scheduled with the precision of a surgeon returning to a wound that had not yet healed. The Reich's airspace, defended with ferocious effectiveness as recently as October 1943, was now effectively open. American and British bombers flew to targets and back with losses that would have seemed impossibly low 18 months earlier. Speer, writing after the war, called the oil campaign the most important of the combined factors that brought about the collapse of Germany. Not the most dramatic, not the most visible, the most important. Galland, whose warnings had been ignored and whose career had been ended partly because he kept insisting on a truth that made his superiors uncomfortable, was asked after the war what the Americans had done that Germany had no answer for. He thought for a moment. Then he said something that air power strategists would quote for decades. They didn't try to defeat us in the air. They took away our ability to be in the air. There is no counter to that. No tactic, no aircraft, no pilot skill answers it. When the fuel is gone, everything is gone. Spaatz had known it since January 1944. Known it when everyone else argued about ball bearings and railway junctions. He had waited, built the case, and finally been given 2 raids to prove it. 2 raids had been enough. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. In the weeks that followed, Allied intelligence teams fanned out across Germany with lists of facilities and individuals they wanted to find before the records were destroyed or the people disappeared. Among the most sought-after interviews was Albert Speer. Speer was cooperative in a way that surprised his interrogators. Intelligent, organized, clearly aware that his best chance at Nuremberg was to demonstrate his value as an information source. He would survive and spend 20 years in prison rather than hanging. But his cooperation reflected something more than self-interest. Speer had spent 6 years watching catastrophically wrong decisions being made around him. The oil campaign was the clearest example. He had told Hitler exactly what would happen. Hitler had not listened. Speer had watched his prediction come true, month by month, with the mechanical certainty of compound interest on a debt that could only grow. When American interrogators asked him to identify the single most decisive factor in Germany's defeat, Speer did not hesitate. The oil campaign, he said. Not the invasion of Normandy. Not the Soviet advance from the east. Not the failure of the German command structure. The oil campaign. The interrogators asked why it had not been adequately countered. Speer's answer was simple and devastating in equal measure. Because no one believed it would work until it already had. The German response to the first oil raids had been defensive. Repair crews, fighter protection, anti-aircraft guns. Rational. Insufficient. Because it treated the oil campaign as a temporary threat rather than an existential one. The assumption, shared by Hitler, Goering, and most of the military leadership, was that American bombing could not be sustained, that repair capability was sufficient, that the situation was serious but manageable. By the time the German leadership accepted that these assumptions were wrong, the fuel situation was no longer manageable. It was terminal. Across Germany, other senior Luftwaffe officers were being asked similar questions. The answers were remarkably consistent. Officer after officer identified the oil campaign as the decisive factor. Not the P-51 Mustang, not Big Week, not American numerical superiority, though that was real and ultimately insurmountable. The fuel. Always the fuel. Hermann Göring, who had spent the war publicly dismissing American bombing and privately screaming at his pilots for failing to stop it, was asked what had been the decisive weapon of the Allied air campaign. He chose his words carefully. He was on trial for his life. Then he said, "The oil campaign was the utmost in deadliness. We never recovered from it. We never could have recovered from it." An extraordinary statement from a man who had called Galland a coward for raising the same point 18 months earlier. The war was over. The Luftwaffe that Göring had commanded, the force that conquered Poland in a week, drove the British from France, blitzed London, fought the Battle of Britain, no longer existed. It had been grounded. Not in a final decisive battle, not in a single catastrophic defeat, by a process that began on May 12, 1944, and never stopped. Karl Spaatz read the interrogation transcripts in Washington and felt, by most accounts, very little that resembled triumph. He had built the argument, survived long enough to execute it, and been proven right by the men who had opposed him. Göring and Speer and Galland, 3 men on opposite sides of the question, had confirmed the same thing. The fuel. Always the fuel. What does it mean to win a war without winning the war? Karl Spatz had spent 3 years answering that question before anyone else was willing to ask it. He had watched the 8th Air Force fly mission after mission against factories and cities, accumulating unsustainable losses and insufficient results. He had watched Schweinfurt accomplish less lasting damage than a single well-placed attack on the fuel system would have achieved. He had understood, from an analysis that was more economic than military, that an industrial nation at war does not run on factories. It runs on the specific things those factories produce. And the most specific, most irreplaceable thing the German war machine needed was fuel. Not tanks. Germany could build tanks. Not aircraft. Germany could build aircraft. Fuel. Germany could not produce fuel from willpower. It required specific chemical processes at specific facilities that were massive, specialized, and visible from the air. And once damaged, they stayed damaged in ways that ball bearing plants and railway yards did not. Repair cycles were longer, more complex, more vulnerable to interruption by the next raid. The campaign proved something theorists had long argued but never demonstrated at scale. An army is not primarily defeated by killing its soldiers. It is defeated by denying it the means to function. Remove those means, and the individual soldier, however brave, however skilled, becomes irrelevant. Immobile. Powerless. Galland had understood this from the other side. He spent the last year commanding pilots who were among the finest combat aviators in history. Men who, given equal fuel and equal numbers, would have been lethal to anyone the Allies sent. The problem was not courage or competence. The system that supported them had been dismantled, piece by piece, raid by raid. He wrote about it in his memoir with the precision of someone who had thought about it every day since. The Luftwaffe had been defeated not in combat, but in logistics. Not by a better fighter, by a better strategy. Galland had known this was coming and been unable to prevent it. Not because he lacked the understanding. He saw it clearly, earlier than most. But the German command system, which by 1944 had concentrated authority in Hitler's hands, could not respond to a threat that Hitler refused to acknowledge. Spatz had won not because he was smarter than his opponents. He had won because his system allowed an idea to be tested, proved, and implemented even when important people disagreed. Eisenhower gave him 2 raids. The 2 raids worked. Empirical evidence overrode bureaucratic resistance. Germany had no equivalent process. An idea contradicting Hitler could not be tested. An argument Göring found inconvenient could not be made. Galland's warning, repeated in every form available to him, disappeared into a system designed to confirm its leaders' beliefs rather than challenge them. This is how a war is lost without losing any single battle. This is how an air force ends up grounded on its own airfields, surrounded by aircraft it cannot fly, watching enemy bombers cross uncontested sky. This is how Schweinfurt becomes irrelevant, and May 12th becomes the day the war ended. Remember Spatz in London, reading the numbers that everyone else had already accepted? Remember Galland in his operations room, signing assessments that no one in power was willing to act on? Remember the fuel plants burning in Saxony on the morning of May 12, 1944? The target that everyone said was the wrong one? Whose destruction Albert Speer would call the most important factor in Germany's defeat. Remember that the Luftwaffe was not shot out of the sky. It was grounded by an idea, and 2 raids, and a man patient enough to wait for the chance to prove it.